So recently, a small team flew a LiDAR rig over a stretch of canopy that looked like nothing but green carpet. The lasers came back through the leaves and returned a ground map. On the laptop screen, a flat forest floor turned into streets, platforms, canals, and walls that should not have existed in a place the modern world kept calling unbroken wilderness. This was not a random scatter of mounds. This was a city plan, the kind that only shows up when thousands of people agree on a shape and then maintain it for generations. And buried in the soil were layers that suggested the first builders started long before anyone thought cities belonged in that part of the world. That is where the title comes from. Older than the pyramids is not a marketing line in this story. It is the gut punch that shows up when you dig down, and the charcoal at the bottom tells you a timeline you were not ready to hear. The way this kind of discovery happens is ugly and boring, and then suddenly beautiful. The crew was not looking for lost anything. They were there because illegal roads have a fingerprint from the air. Straight cuts, fresh edges, patchy openings. You can train a model to spot that stuff. While they were sweeping a buffer zone, the pilot called out a cluster of uplands that looked wrong in a good way. Ridges were too smooth. The drainage looked redirected. They made a second pass, and the screens drew clean angles where nature loves curves. That is a tell. You add a grid. You plan a return flight at a different sun angle. You run the pass again. If the shapes stay, they are not a trick of light. They are a plan. Back at camp, they processed the point cloud and pulled the canopy off digitally. There it was, a city footprint in the dirt under the trees. Parallel avenues running east to west for kilometers. Perpendicular spines that linked platforms like vertebrae. Rectangular plazas, one after the other like beads on a string. Radiating causeways that left the core and arrowed toward distant hills. Defensive ditches and berms that did not follow rivers or ravines, they followed intention. And then the part that makes your skin go cold. Along the main axis, the builders had cut shallow terraces that maxed the solstice sun like a set of steps for light. You do not get that by accident. You do it because your calendar is the sky and your city keeps the score. Everyone gets excited at that point, but LiDAR gives you shape, not age. To figure out when it started, you put on boots, not just brains. The ground team spent 2 weeks fighting vines, ants, and humidity to reach the edge of one of the platforms. They stayed outside the cleared core and found a place where a feeder ditch met a main canal. That is where you dig. You open a trench. You read the soil like a stack of books. Top is root mat and leaf litter. Below that, dark earth with flecks of charcoal that smell sweet and old. Below that, a band of sterile clay from a flood that rolled through and reset everything. Under that, more dark. 1. You bag the charcoal from the bottom of a post hole. Same at the edge of a hearth. You keep the samples dry and you do not talk dates until the lab runs the numbers. The city plan got weirder as they walked it. The main causeways were flanked by long, low platforms that were not houses. They were the bones of old raised fields. In flood country, you do not plant straight in the dirt if you are thinking beyond one harvest. You raise rows, water flows between. Fish ride the water. Soil stays where you put it. The team found the line still there, faint and stubborn. Between the rows, the ground had that black, crumbly texture you can spot with your eyes closed, if you have ever handled terra preta, human-made dark earth. Charcoal mixed with bone and husk and ash, built year after year until lousy soil became a battery for nutrients. That soil is not an accident. It is culture turned into chemistry. It stays fertile long after the hands that made it are gone. Off the eastern edge of the core, they found a reservoir cut into clay, not a pond. A waterworks. Channels fed it from upslope. Other channels left it on a timer set by a wooden gate that rotted out long ago. In the wall of the reservoir, there were holes that used to hold posts. The bottoms of those holes held charcoal where posts were burned and replaced. You count the cycles and you are counting years. The team cut a narrow trench through one of the causeways and found a repeated pattern. Packed earth. More packed earth. A layer of char where a maintenance burn baked the surface and sterilized it. You do that when your roads are also your parade ground and your drainage spine. A city that burns its streets and rebuilds them is a city that plans to be around. The lab results came back in waves. The top layers were younger than the height machine ever wants. Post-contact centuries. Charcoal from the last people to maintain fields before disease did what disease always did. Nobody was surprised at that. You expect late use. The chills started with deeper pieces. A broad hearth from the edge of a platform came back older than the empires people teach you about in class when they talk about this continent. Deeper still, a post hole under a flood layer dated so far back the field lead made the lab run controls twice. Older than Old Kingdom Egypt is not a phrase you yell on the radio. It is a sentence you say quietly in a tent because if it is right, the story of cities moves sideways and the next year of your life belongs to this one spot. Now take a breath and keep the sober brain on. Old charcoal beneath a site does not prove the city stood that old. Floods lay wood where people later build. Lightning starts fires and layers that get buried. What made this different was context. That deep charcoal came from the bottom of a carved hole that matched the pattern of other post holes, which matched the geometry of the platform, which matched the axis of the whole city. You're not looking at random forest fire under a later plan. You're looking at the first anchor points someone set with intent, then replaced again for centuries. You can argue margins, you can argue calibration curves, but if you are being honest with the dirt in your hands, the deepest anchors belong to the builders, not to chance. As the trench work grew, the shape of daily life pulled into view. House pads sat beside gardens in a rhythm you see in river cultures around the world. A cluster of smaller mounds near a plaza held dozens of clay discs, broken, blackened, and stashed in a pit like a retired toolkit. Those discs were cooking stones from a kind of earth oven you can reset over and over. Nearby were charred palm nut shells and river shell middens layered like a cake. This was not a hunting camp. This was a food economy that ran day and night. A city makes waste patterns you can recognize like a heartbeat. This one beat a long time. The most unsettling part for a lot of people was the war story that showed up in the ditches. The outer berm was not just for water. It had a palisade trench on its crest, now a ghost line full of darker soil. You only cut that trench when you plan to set posts tall and close. On the near side of a gap, the team found points worked from hardwood and a few from river stone, burned, snapped, and discarded in a layer of ash. A palisade and a burn layer at a gateway is not a theory. It is a note from a bad day when someone attacked and someone else set fire or fought back with fire. Cities attract trade. Trade attracts envy. Envy attracts trouble. The forest swallowed the walls, but not the story about people and pressure. These expeditions always come with rumors that go off like fireworks. Lost metal, secret vaults, advanced tech hidden in vines. The boring truth on the ground was more impressive. No metal required. The engineering here was earth. Water, wood, fire, and time used with a level of patience that makes modern builders look frantic. Canals that can be cleared after a flood with hand tools, causeways that rise just high enough that dry season dust does not choke your lungs, reservoirs that settle silt before it hits your fields, gardens that ride the river up and down without washing away. If you are looking for genius, stop staring at the shiny and learn to love a ditch. Cut a hand wide and a man deep. Running straight is a creed for 3 kilometers without a laser level. A week into the ground, truthing, a side team made it out to a ridge that looked like nothing from the air and everything from the ground. A circle of low earthen banks tucked under big trees. Inside, a shallow basin filled with leaf mold, post holes around the rim. The first read was ceremony because anything circular makes people think ceremony. The team measured the gaps and the angle of the main opening and found it matched the sunrise on a date that split the planting season. You can call it religion or you can call it scheduling. Either way, a city that can put a calendar in dirt and hold it for centuries is a city with leadership, memory, and a way to pass the plan to kids who will be old one day. What about writing? Everyone wants writing. There were no carved tablets, no inked bark folded into books. What turned up in a trash pit behind a platform was more humble and possibly more powerful. Strands of braided cord with knots at regular intervals, bundled and pressed flat by layers of soil. They were fragmentary and fragile. You do not need a label to guess what you were looking at. Counts, harvests, head tallies, schedules. A way to remember in fiber when your paper is humidity and your filing cabinet is a gourd. That is not fantasy. That is how a city with no metal coins, no trucks, and no draft animals still keeps accounts and keeps appointments. There is a question that shows up every time people hear about a city where a forest stands now. Why did it end? The honest answer is always the same. More than one reason. The trenches turned up evidence for a flood event that must have been brutal. A thick, sterile layer laid down across fields like cement, a break in the palisade line that was not repaired for a while, a gap in hearth charcoal that hints at a quiet stretch when fewer fires burned. Maybe the river shifted and ate the wrong bank. Maybe a rival cut canals upstream. Maybe a dry run hit and the reservoir ran shallow for too many years in a row. Maybe a disease rolled through a population dense enough that beds sat too close for comfort. Cities end for more than one reason. Sometimes they fade, sometimes they break. The forest is patient either way. There is another layer of risk you have to talk about if you care about the people who live there now. Once a story like this leaks, the worst people perk up. Illegal miners hear the word old and they hear treasure. Loggers hear city and they hear a grid they can drive. Tourist operators hear lost and they hear money. That is why responsible teams do not drop coordinates. They file to the correct offices. They let local and national agencies decide the protection plan. They work with the communities at the edges who already know the land in ways outsiders never will. The fastest way to kill a discovery like this is to turn it into a circus where the only thing that gets preserved is an argument on the internet. The aerial work expanded. The more they scanned, the less that single city looked like an outlier. Up and down the basin, faint grids blinked through the green. Hilltop compounds, roadside hamlets, field systems that braided together like a net. The city did not sit alone. It sat in a constellation of settlements linked by causeways and water routes. Think of a necklace of hubs rather than one massive capital. The big platforms fed the little ones, and the little ones fed the big. Information moved on foot and by canoe and, during the dry time, over roads made to stay passable in dust. The network was the civilization. The forest hid the hubs, but the pattern survived the leaves. News like this always makes people pick teams. Romantic fantasy versus dry skepticism. The truth in the dirt does not care about any of that. Cities are not miracles. They are agreements. We will dig here. We will eat here. We will watch each other's kids here. We will fix the canal every year, whether we feel like it or not. What makes this discovery special is not that it proves magic. It proves that the Amazon is not a blank stage where nature alone writes the script. It is a library where the shelves fell over and the books got covered in vines. The pages are still there if you are willing to get bitten by ants and keep reading. The fear and awe part sneaks up on you when you stand on a plaza edge and listen. The forest is loud with life. The ground under your boots hums because the roots are always working, and under that hum your brain starts to hear a rhythm that is not yours. You are standing on a surface tamped by feet that passed the same way for centuries to grind a flat edge where nothing stays flat for long. You could hate humidity and bugs and still feel respect settling in. Somebody chose this spot because of water, wind, and light. Somebody set a line and said, "This is the center." Somebody's grandchildren taught their grandchildren where to plant, where to dance, where to bury, where to fix the gate. When you see all that in a LiDAR cross-section and a trench wall, you stop thinking about lost and start thinking about continuity. So how do you talk about the older than the pyramids line without getting lost in a fight about dates? You stick to the method. You show the hole, the fill, the charcoal, the context, the lab notes, the calibration. You admit uncertainty, and you underline the weird fact that even if you move the numbers by a reasonable margin, the earliest layers still land far earlier than anyone thought people in that region were building at this scale. What matters is not whether a hearth is a century this way or that. What matters is that a city plan sat under a canopy where the modern map rode nothing but green, and the plan is so old it stretches your timeline like taffy. People will ask what the city was called. There is no answer yet. Names stick to maps when the people doing the naming write and carve. The descendants of whoever lived there might hold a word that fits. They might not. This is where humility has to show up. Not every file gets a tidy label. The power move is to protect first and label later. The living communities near those ridges decide what the story becomes public. They get a say because it is their river, their hills, their gods, and their dead. If you are producing a show around this, walk people through the human side. The crew fighting off biting flies while they hold the LiDAR backpack steady for a ground slice that will line up with the aerial pass. The local guides who know which vines hold water and which ones burn your skin. The moment when a trench wall slumps because the soil was waiting to move and you have to reset with a slower cut. The smell of ancient hearth when you pop a block of clay and a dry breath from a fire that went out 1,000 years ago hits air again. This is not cosplay archaeology. This is people getting humbled by a landscape that hides giants under leaves. The threat section matters, and it is not sexy. Roads punch in faster than laws move. One bulldozer can erase a wall that lasted 1,000 years in an afternoon. A dredge can silt a reservoir that fed 10,000 people in a week. The same satellite tools that help find the place can help shield it if the policy kicks in. Patrol routes update. Alerts trigger. Community rangers get gear that the bad guys used to have all to themselves. When you tell this story, do not end with a mythical flourish. End with a link in your head between discovery and duty. You found a thing. It now owns part of your calendar. You can sense the pushback in your audience. Older than the pyramid sounds like a trick. It is fair to be cautious. It is not fair to pretend river civilizations are a surprise. Look around the planet. Humans find fertile floodplains, figure out how to surf the seasons, and then they start writing in earth. Bend a river a little. Catch fish with traps instead of a spear. Plant on raised rows. Carve a plaza where the wind will pull smoke. Clock the sun with posts and holes and shadows. Treat soil like a bank account. None of that is outside the human playbook. What is outside the story most of us learned is that the Amazon was empty of that level of planning until recently. That story belongs in the trash. The deepest chills did not come from dates. They came from the sense that the forest we see as pure and timeless is actually a collaboration between people and nature that never stopped. The dark soils around the city ripple out to places that are now wild. Fruit and nut trees stand in patterns that look random until you overlay an old causeway and a plaza and see that someone was planting for a walk that started at sunrise and ended at a water gate. You can march through those trees today and think no one is here. You would be wrong. The ghost of a plan is still feeding animals, which spread seeds, which keep the plan alive. That is a city's afterlife when stone is not your main material, not ruins. Influence. There is a technical detail that needs airtime because it keeps the story honest. Preservation favors stone and bone in dry places. The Amazon is wet, acidic, and busy. Wood disappears, cloth disappears, clay survives if it is fired but often shatters. What lasts best are earthworks and chemical signatures in soil. That means any estimate of how big, how complex, or how old will come with caution. The absence of a palace does not mean there was no leadership. The absence of a wall does not mean there was no defense. In this site, you have both, which is rare. That is why people are excited. The earth itself decided to keep the receipts. At some point, this is going to spill over into the big fight about how we talk about ancient people. Gift them the courtesy of being complicated. They had ritual and war and accounting and garden science and flood engineering and music and probably a laugh we would recognize if we heard it. They were not gods and they were not savages. They were us with a different set of tools and a different set of constraints. Their city proves that the toolkit was enough to build something that lasted longer than most modern suburbs will. You can respect that without turning it into a fantasy novel. You also have to sit with the sadness. Something that organized and long-lived is gone at the surface. A plaza that held 1,000 feet now holds roots. A canal that moved fish now holds still, water under lilies and dragonflies. That loss is real. It does not mean the people lost. Their descendants are on the rivers. Their farming tricks never died. Their soil still feeds. Their calendar still fits the sky. The city is quiet. The knowledge is not. The right ending for a piece like this is not a drum roll. It is a quiet set of sentences that tells the truth. A LiDAR pass cut through leaves and showed that a city grid runs under a forest that most maps wrote off as empty. Trenches in the dirt match the grid and produce layers that stretch past comfortable timelines. Fields, canals, reservoirs, plazas, walls, and calendars sit where birds scream and leaves rot. The dates are early. The plan is careful. The scale is big. The story we tell kids about the Amazon being a place where civilization could not happen needs to be replaced with a story about a civilization that got swallowed by green and kept feeding the green long after the music stopped.